Good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kutin.
Thank you for watching Consider This. Now, today on the show, we're going to find out a little bit more about Policy Lab, which is a youth-led initiative that sets out to train youths every weekend in policy making as well as civil society engagement skills. Now, joining us on the show today, we have James Chai and Faris Aiman, who are the founders of Policy Lab. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so I hope I did that correctly in describing what Policy Lab was, but perhaps you could start with your own words in describing what Policy Lab is and how it all came to be. James, why don't you go?
I have a lot of friends around me who are way smarter than I am, and these people are kind and they want to do something for the country, which means that they do care. But the route of politics is very unappealing to them because it is normally seen as very dirty. It involves a lot of backstabbing and self-interest. So that route is definitely untenable, at least not for now. And the route of civil service in the government is too long, it's too arduous, and a lot of them, they have some stint in it, but they realize that the whole process is too frustrating because it's inefficient, right?
Oh my God, so you're saying at one point they're going to graduate to backstabbing. They're going to be okay with it.
At least they must be trained with the right mentality and the right mindset, right? Of knowing that policy should triumph against politics.
Why? Do they not believe that now? I mean, is there this perception that policy doesn't work?
Yes, I think most of the discussions in the mainstream these days are primarily on politics and personalities. Who says what, right? And it's normally still revolving around identities, right? Not really that much about what actually needs to be done to change the country for the better.
Okay, I think that's very contentious, but we'll come back to that. I want, Faris, tell me about your understanding of the way politics and policy come together, because clearly public policy comes from the state, it comes from governments, and so you need politicians in order to communicate strategies and to change behavior. What's your thought?
The way we see it is that politicians are one thing, but behind those politicians, they must have a good team that can know the things that are going on, the statistics, the data, and at the same time, they need to do real policy research, because nowadays we can see a lot of politicians, they only look good in the pictures, but at the same time, they don't actually do something that are beneficial.
This is the perception of, you would say, the majority of young people today. And because you identified this perception, decided to do something to address it, and that's how Policy Lab came to be, I take it. So what is it that you guys are doing? You talk about weekend classes and training for civil engagement skills, but what does that actually entail? James?
Yes, so every week we would hold a series of policy making skills classes, right? So these would revolve around soft skills building, like writing, research, public speaking. On the other hand, you have a subject matter, so history, economics, law, politics. So the idea is that anyone who wants to participate in any kind of policy making at all must be sort of equipped with some of these skills to be able to do well in those areas.
Okay, Faris, jump in there and tell us a little bit about the both of you. I mean, you're legally trained, you're a lawyer, and you're an engineer. So what makes you the kind of people who are kind of ripe to lead such a program, which is about policy? And there's a lot of specialized policy degree programs and so on and so forth.
When it comes to engineering, the background deals with a lot of statistics and mathematics. So I think that is where I can jump in and contribute something. But at the same time, I believe that you don't have to be a lawyer or an economist or a political scientist to contribute to policy making. For example, I work in the telco and IT sector. Recently, YB Gobin released a budget of 22 billion. And at the same time, Syed Saddiq released a bill about 6 billion to produce 350K jobs. We can somewhat take two of those elements together and see where we can move on from that. Things like upscaling and the jobs that are needed in the market based on the industry.
Which is what is interesting about these classes, right? So you talk about soft skill classes, subject matter classes. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind is with the subject matter classes, I mean, history, economics, isn't that all taught in secondary school? And don't you learn that in university as well, you know, according to your major, your specialization? Yeah. And soft skills. So where does the soft skills come into play? Why do you feel like you need to teach people the soft skills when it comes to advocacy work?
Yeah, we hear this quite often, that employers are not employing a lot of fresh graduates because they lack soft skills. So a lot of soft skills when it comes to writing research, what we would consider quite basic, is not really acquired by young people yet. And one of the common assumptions in a lot of secondary school as well as universities is that you must already have known this even when nobody has taught you to do it, right? So we bring in a bunch of people who have done it more frequently than the others. We won't consider them to be lecturers or expert in their field, but probably what we consider peer expert, people who know slightly more because they've done it a lot.
So they're relatively young, the people
Yes.
who teach these classes?
So the group of people are 35 and below. The idea is that we want to not have this lecturer coming in talking down at you, right? But probably just sharing something that they know slightly more than the average person, right? So all these skills are not taught in schools for sure. But when it comes to the subject matter, it is also taught incompletely, or either they don't encourage that space of thought. So for example, history, right? Everyone would assume that you know what happened in Malaysia of the past, right? As well as what happened internationally. But most people actually don't, even having gone through the secondary school syllabus, right? So what we have done for that particular class was that we focus on thinking about history. How do you consider narratives and what happened in the past? It's more about considering questions.
Okay, so but is that related to policy? I mean, you're looking at history and policy, or historical narratives and policy, or is it just a pure history and considerations about historical
Thinking
narratives?
about history, perhaps.
The logic is this, right? In order to participate in any kind of policy making at all, you must have some knowledge of what happened in the past of Malaysia to inform your decision, right? You also must know at least how economics work, as to which is fiscal policy, what's monetary policy. So these we consider to be so basic that everyone should be equipped of it, right? It's not specifically on the history of policy making, but it could be. But it's just ways of considering things that you probably will consider as prerequisites.
Faris, what's your sense of this?
Adding on to James, it is true that we learn history, but we must not forget that history is intertwined with the economic dynamics that we are experiencing today. For example, race A is involved, I'm talking about back then. Race A is involved in industry A. Race B is probably working in government. Race C is probably in the farms, in farming. So these are things that we need to look through and change.
Are these frank discussions? Now I'm just wondering, you know, of the classes that you've had, I mean, I'm guessing, what would you consider some of the more popular subjects that people have decided to sign up for?
So the most popular one is currently how to research. So those involve how to research. So something that you don't imagine to be that popular, but you know, people really think that that's an important skill to learn, because these are the classes that teaches you about, you know, some tips to research quicker, as well as some
beyond
of the
Wikipedia.
Yeah, beyond Wikipedia, right? As well as the pitfalls to avoid. Because a lot of people, even after having gone through 3 or 4 years of university, they probably only figured out how to research efficiently and quickly towards the end, or never at all. Right.
Faris, the people who come, who are they? Could you give us a quick sense of the demographic?
Most of them are young and working professionals, spanning across industries, coming from banks, coming from in the engineering sector. Some of them are researchers. So Policy Lab, not only all of them, despite their differences in terms of skills, they come together and want to contribute on the same thing.
Is it largely an urban-centric initiative? Because, you know, we've heard comments before that with NGOs, it tends to be the same people over and over again. But with advocacy work or with Policy Lab, have you noticed that it's the same people coming every weekend, or, you know, is it largely urban?
To be honest with you, no. We actually do get quite a number of fresh faces every weekend. Usually we do introduction, as in we ask them to do a quick introduction about themselves. This is their first time and all. So we actually do get new people every week, and that is a good sign on behalf of us.
All right, so we're going to continue this conversation about Policy Lab in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you, and on the show with us we have James and Faris, the founders of Policy Lab, which is a youth-led initiative which holds classes on the weekends to teach youth about policy making and so civil society engagement skills. So we were talking a little bit before the break about what it is that you guys do. Now I want to get a sense from both of you, what is it that you want to achieve with this? Faris, do you mind starting?
We want to somewhat make Policy Lab, to a certain extent, one of the extending arms of the government in terms of policy making. We feel that the government and politicians in general, especially today, are not as efficient as they should be. So we have the energy of young people, we have their expertise, and then we have all the instructors coming in, teaching every week. We hope to see them and contribute something in terms of the economy, in terms of job creation, upscaling.
Okay, can I just sort of interrogate you a little bit about this assumption, because it's a very popular assumption about the inefficiencies of government, and I think we all, myself included, repeat this over and over again. But what evidence do we have, and how do you measure the inefficiencies, and why do you think just having young people along in the conversation will change that? I mean, how do you come to these conclusions?
Number one is the latest statistics from Bank Negara saying that 12.7% youth are unemployed. Number two,
so you see that as a failure of public policy?
I do actually, we do actually, because at the same time, industries, they need to rely a lot on overseas overseas resources. We usually like to import skills from Singapore, from India, from China, from America, and so forth. And it's not that we do not want and can do all this. It's just that we do not have the right education system, we do not have the right training facilities, and we do not have the right industry insights.
Okay, so that was one data point. The graduate unemployment is a data point of policy failure, right? James, your thoughts on this? You know, have you come too quickly to a conclusion that, you know, one can kind of write off government, or that the government will be righted if you guys come into the story?
No, I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. Like, we're not here to try to solve government inefficiency per se, right? It is definitely a complementary role that we're trying to provide. What we think is lacking currently is that our main base, or audience base, feels like there is no channel for them to contribute, right? Our platform is primarily to bring these people together, to meet people who are like them, and to build certain sets of skills and then do something together to influence government policy, right? So to a certain extent, there is goodwill in terms of us wanting to contribute to the government. It's not necessarily antagonistic.
Yeah, well, you know, you know that road, well, it was paved with good intentions that leads to disaster, but okay.
So I want to get your thoughts, James, because Faris answered my question of what you hope to achieve with Policy Lab. What is it that you want to achieve? So you talked about it being a platform, a channel to give young people a voice, perhaps a more consultative role, but what is it ultimately that you hope Policy Lab creates within young people?
So the immediate aim that we have is actually quite short term, which is like, I just need to make sure that each week we run those classes well, so these people who come together on a Saturday morning think that it's worthwhile to do, right? There were natural things that come as a result of them congregating together, right? So one of the things that we have been doing is that we are venturing into teaching secondary school children about civic education, and it is from this group of people that those ideas came about, right? There were also research work that we're getting in from some think tanks and academic institutions. So there's a large pool of people who are ready to do some research work that could actually do something about it, right? On the last week was the budget, right? It was just released. We also have a committee that's analyzing that budget voluntarily, right? So that's what we're talking about.
It's like a brain trust.
It's
You've
something like
created
that.
a bit of a brain trust with Policy Lab and hoping to grow that collective brain.
So because it is sustained primarily by the goodwill of the people who come about, right? We just have to remain as open-minded as possible as to what they can do. What we're really doing is preparing a platform as a first step for them to still get into policy making of some sorts besides their corporate day job.
Okay, I want to ask this, and this has to do with the way in which public policy is formed. It's often based on certain assumptions, and depending on your politics, those assumptions change, right? And we have the full spectrum of political persuasions in this country, from free marketeers to people who believe in state intervention, socialists to neo-liberal advocates, right?
Yes.
So do you guys have an ideological position, Faris?
To improve the quality and lower down the cost of living for Malaysians. And second is to provide as much jobs, quality jobs, as much as you can. I think that is one of the angles. And also to narrow the gap between policy-making skills and activity between between policy-making skills and the public.
Okay, but surely a lot of people who get into politics or public policy say they're doing it for the public good, right? Mm-hmm. So that doesn't tell you what your ideological underpinnings and assumptions are. Many people will take ideas, which is a think tank, says that small government is preferable.
Free
the markets is the ones that actually will make the best decisions. Other people believe in heavy state intervention. What's your particular position on that?
When it comes to Policy Lab, there is no fixed ideological position yet, because the reason for that is that ours is primarily banked on the people who come to our policy classes, right? We haven't gotten to the stage that we're forced to decide one way or another what we should adopt. It is preferable that the people who come to our classes, they meet people who are like them, and then they form an NGO to do something of their own based on those sets of beliefs. We're quite okay with that particular outcome. What we also want to address at the same time, probably what's most important for us as a larger goal, is that there must be at least more ideas than the current situation, which to a certain extent there is a bankruptcy of ideas post GE14, when before the election, the assumption was that nothing good could be done before defeating a Barisan National Government. And then, and that period has sort of stifled a lot of our creativity of thinking about ideas. And therefore, just by having more ideas, it would be good.
Yeah, so
we don't make ideas the organization, just ideas.
Discourse, which I think is the point,
Yes.
right? To have a platform for discourse, but also I think what we're forgetting is that young people are still building their worldview. So they may not be set in their ideological thinking the way that all curmudgeons like we are set in their way. So perhaps Policy Lab can become a platform for them to discover what ideologies fit their worldview best. All right, we're going to come back and continue our conversation about Policy Lab in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to consider this. Thank you for staying with Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kutan, and we're chatting to the good folks of Policy Lab, James Chai as well as Faris Aiman. Now, I want to get both of you your thoughts on voter education. So how is what Policy Lab doing different from, say, voter education when it comes to, educating an entire new generation of young voters with Undi 18? Is it the same? Do you see similarities, or is it different? Faris, do you want to take this?
I think for Policy Lab, we are slightly more technical, because when I see for other NGOs, they are more towards speaking out, towards awareness. This is your responsibility. But in Policy Lab, we are more towards calculations, data, statistics.
Real skills.
Real
right?
skills.
But you mean you're teaching those people who come to you about data? About what kind of data? What exactly do you mean by you're more towards data?
More towards data, as in, because of course when it comes to crafting framework in policies, we need to find data, find the right, because right now we have a lot of data. It is up to us whether what we want to do with it and put it in a more structural and organized form, and to make something good out of it.
Okay, well, you also mentioned a little bit earlier before the break, James, that Policy Lab is a platform for discourse with young people. What's missing in this? What conversations are you having that was missing, say, a year ago? Conversations that you guys are having with your peers now that a year ago, 2 years ago, was missing from the discourse space?
What we think was that because it was so difficult to defeat the Barisan National Government, at that time, a lot of people from civil society organization as long as you have some sort of influence in society, you get sort of co-opted or absorbed into politics. So what happens after the election was that there's sort of a vacuum in the civil society space. And I think civil societies, organizations are extremely important in between elections, because then, if not, your role would be reduced to just voting, right? Now, in that particular context, all sorts of discourse hasn't really been harnessed yet. We don't see enough civil society organization making it to the mainstream, developing some sort of narrative. So we think that with Policy Lab, by preparing a platform, it at least encourages those kind of discourse forward.
Okay, I want to ask you this, and this is directly related to the question of public policy, because public policy is often an issue of trade-offs. Well, what do you want, and how what do you have to give up in order to get something else? Opportunity cost, right? Do you think young people understand this, especially people coming through the civil society organizations who are very quick to have a laundry list of demands?
Yes.
And and the Pakatan is suffering for its manifesto, which is a laundry list of demands, right? With no sense of the limitations. Fiscal and also limitations that are placed on governments to actually realize this. A trade-off, something that you kind of want to deal with and grapple with?
We think that considerations of discourse as well as limitations are more likely if policy is your main focus. If politics is what you're particularly driven by, which actually civil society are also driven by that when there are more egoistic intentions, right? Then it would be thwarted by something else, right? We see a lot of politicians always coming up with quick policy suggestions, and the idea is that, trust me with it, I'll handle it, without much details as to how you're going to execute it.
6,350,000 jobs.
Not particularly, but something along those lines, right? Where people are not normally informed as to how do you solve such a complex issue, right? With an emphasis on policy, it's more likely for you to consider those kind of trade-offs. And we are seeing that among our group of people, where you are taught subjects which are quite agnostic in terms of their ideological leanings, but more emphasis on the practicalities, on saying that if you want to look into certain issues, you must also be wary of the limitations that are involved in it.
Are there, I guess, I'm just wondering whether there is significant interest in this. I mean, you're assuming that young people as a whole, one block, which is never the case, right? No one community acts the same way, votes the same way, thinks the same way, multifaceted. So are the young people that you're targeting a minority? Are largely youth apathetic when it comes to policy making? Is that a conversation that you're having with yourselves within Policy Lab?
I mean, how do you address the apathy? The people who don't want to get involved, don't know how to get involved, in fact, don't really just want to avoid it.
Yeah.
Okay. I think one thing is that it also, because right now our classes are done in English, I think it has to be as diverse as possible, because James and I, we have plans to do Policy Lab in Bahasa Malaysia as well, and that will somewhat target more Malay people, hopefully, in the future. Because the thing,
Malay speaking
people, because our concern for Policy Lab is that we do not want it to be as distant. Because from my personal experience, also my peers, sometimes they feel like policy making, politics, and all these public and intellectual discourses can be seen as somewhat distant from them. And I think we need to break the language barrier in order for us to reach out to more people in the future.
Yeah, could I just add on one point? Because we had the same suspicion before we started, whether the young people that we normally read on newspapers, whether they're actually apathetic or whether they're disillusioned.
Right?
That's the assumption, right? But week after week, we have consistently at least 30 to 40 people coming to our classes. In the span of 4 to 5 months, we have already 290 people coming into our system. And 1/3 of it were developed by word of mouth. Right? And that's why we think that's the greatest testament that these people really still do care about what happens to the country. And it is probably true, our assumption at the start, that we are filling in a gap that direly needs to be filled in.
Well, a lot of what you've said seems to be also in line with what the Youth and Sports Ministry wants to do. So is there any collaboration happening there? I mean, are you engaging with the ministry, the minister, in fact?
Or do you want to be independent?
No, we think that we are very, very open to exploring opportunities like that, because after all, they are the people who hold the greatest levers of power. So any kind of influence that we could have into policy making is certainly something that we are interested in, either as an organization or people who came through our system and they individually discover it, right? So Faris himself is involved in one of the majlis that is held through a consultative session, and we think that those are important. Wherever he needs any kind of help in developing ideas as well as research, we have at least a pool of people from Policy Lab who are already ready to do this kind of work. So we think that that's the extent of our involvement for now.
All right, in the little time that we have left, gentlemen, can you tell us a little bit, you know, if our viewers here want to know more about Policy Lab, where do they go to?
If our Facebook page, so it is spelled POLISILAB, so that's Policy Lab, or on Instagram. So it would be quite obvious to find, and anyone who's interested to come for our week-to-week classes, they are definitely more than open to do so. They only need to fill out an simple application form, and they will be able to access classes like economics, history, writing, and it's free.
Free classes.
Free classes.
That's always exciting.
All right, there you go. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being on the show today. So all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kutan. We will be back with you same time tomorrow. Good night.